bit about Jason. Originally from Punta Gorda, Florida, and now based in Fort Worth, Texas, Jason Vuic is an award-winning writer, and here's how he describes his specialty, which I love: creative nonfiction.
Yeah.
That's perfect. That is so you, Jason. And his first book, The Yugo, The Rise and Fall of the Worst Car in History, received rave reviews. He was just telling me before we started that he was like shocked and surprised at the reception that it got. More than 100 publications raved about it, including, and this is just a few, Vanity Fair, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Mother Jones, and Time, not to mention a lot of cars publications. Then his second book, The Yucks, 2 years in Tampa with the losingest team in NFL history.
You see a theme.
You see a theme. Garnered similar reviews. And I learned about Jason after he published his third book, The SWAMP PEDDLERS, which is a tale of definitely misguided land development in Florida during that raucous period in the 50s and 60s when it was growth at any cost. The book won a first place gold from the very prestigious Florida Book Awards, and no wonder. It not only addresses the issue of how these crazy land salesmen were developing just massive communities without any urban planning. I mean, they didn't even have downtowns in most cases. But it's also wildly entertaining because Jason has so many anecdotes about the marketing gimmicks, the outrageous, over-the-top way they marketed these empty lots in Florida. And somehow they managed to sell bazillions of lots to basically, I guess, to working class Northerners who were dreaming of a Florida retirement. And a lot of these were sold sight unseen in the middle of swampland, desolates, thousands of empty roads surrounding them. It was like one of the greatest marketing schemes of all time. When I heard about the book, I was editing Forum, the magazine of the Florida Humanities Council at that time. And I asked Jason if he could write a magazine piece inspired by the book. And that piece, Nowhere Land, just a few months ago, won a triple crown of awards from the Florida Magazine Association. Woo! Best Feature Story was one of the awards. Also, he won awards for Best In-Depth Reporting and Best Public Service, which I thought was really neat. And I think Jason has another winner with this book, A Town Without Pity. It focuses on two riveting and pretty much heart-wrenching stories that brought national attention and infamy to our inland neighbor, Arcadia. The book has everything I've come to expect from Jason. Meticulous research, exhaustive research, page-turning drama, and a cast of characters so weird and wild that you keep asking yourself, is this really nonfiction that I'm reading? And although the book is about Arcadia, Sarasota turns out to be a major player in it. There's like the hard-driving district attorney who suppressed evidence and convicted an innocent father, a black migrant worker, of the murder of his own children. And there's also the way that Sarasota embraced the Ray family. Do any of you guys remember the Ray family? They lived in Arcadia. I see a number do. They had 4 children, and 3 of them, their sons, all were hemophiliacs and had contracted the HIV virus. Remember, in those days, they weren't screening blood transfusions at the beginning of the outbreak. And when the news became public in Arcadia, they basically drove the family out. And I don't mean just uninformed citizens, but the city elected officials, the school board. And Sarasota did embrace them. They ended up moving to Sarasota. And I was editor of Sarasota magazine at the time, and I remember vividly reporting on some of the events and people that Jason featured in the book. But let's let him speak for himself. Jason, it is great to meet you in person. Welcome to Sarasota. Let's start with growing up in Punta Gorda. what was that like in the era that you grew up there, and how did it shape you as an author?
Punta Gorda was, is this on?
Just turn it on.
Turn your mic on.
Hello? I don't, hello? It, on what?
Take hers.
Oh,
No,
take
Oh,
it.
that's a good idea.
We can turn it on. It should be.
It's not flicking.
Test.
Hey.
There we go.
Growing up in Punta Gorda, I don't get that question very often. It was sleepy, very sleepy. Charlotte County, Southwest Florida is older, we know demographically. Charlotte County is the oldest of the old. Today, it's the median age in Charlotte County is 60. And so I grew up in tiny Punta Gorda, and I loved it, actually. My parents were school teachers, and we lived in old Punta Gorda in a 100-year-old house near Gilcrest Park, a big, beautiful house. And Punta Gorda was this great, it wasn't, Sarasota has so many high rises and move-ins, and Naples, those were our poles of Southwest Florida. And Punta Gorda didn't have the barrier islands, didn't have the beaches. And so we always wished it were bigger and there was more to do, but then we always knew that if it were nicer and not as quaint, then we'd get rolled over with development, right? My sister and I just talked about that today, that we're kind of lucky that our Charlotte Harbor was kind of a brown harbor. And we had, and we had muddy bottoms, and we love it. I love it, actually, more than Sanibel, more than Captiva, honestly. It was just more working class. But it was, for me as a writer, it was a great place to grow up because it was old Florida and new put together. It was along I-75 and along the Tamiami Trail, so we had a lot of people that would move in, we had new ideas, and I had friends that went to college all over America. But then we had country folk. My dad was a principal in an elementary school where they tracked them. They were all white, and about 5% went to college. And these were tough Floridian, crackers, and not in kind of negative way, Florida crackers. These, early settlers to Florida. These were 5th and 6th generation Floridians. And so for me, my mother was a native Floridian. She was from Inverness, went to Citrus High School. And my father was a northern mill kid, and they got married in college in Pennsylvania. My mother said, "I'll marry you, but I'm not living up here. I'm moving back to Florida." And they got their first teaching jobs in Key West in 1960.
Oh, wow.
And my dad said, "You think it was great?" And Tennessee Williams lived there then, but it wasn't at all idyllic. And kids would come to class with no shoes because they were fishermen. They would fish with their parents. Sometimes they didn't come to class because they had to go fish, and they didn't make much money at all. And so they moved to Lauderdale to make more money because they were broke. And then it just got a little big for them, and they were visiting Arcadia randomly
Oh, wow.
in 1968. And we're driving up the Tamiami Trail, and you could go right up 17, and they took a left to check out Punta Gorda, and they saw our old house. And my parents bought it. It was $20,000 with a 30-year mortgage and a rental. And the rental paid the mortgage the whole time I was growing up. And so we weren't rich, but we were able to travel because we didn't have a mortgage, and I miss it. I miss Punta Gorda. I really do. I wish there was a way, for me, reading books. I could have been an attorney, handling wills or handling estates, and I just wanted to do other things. But my sister and I too, we both kind of miss our youth. It was idyllic. It wasn't quite as, Florida is now, 3 million people a decade move here? So it's a little different. It's still sleepier, but it's not the same place.
No, it's changed so much. One question that really struck me, looking over your body of work, you've written books that are about such seemingly unrelated subjects and pretty unique subjects. A car, a sports team, Florida real estate, development, now this newest book. How do you choose your subjects, or do they choose you? How does that work?
Well, I have a PhD in history. My wife is an historian. We met at Indiana University, and she's a professor at TCU. And I didn't like academic history. I love going to conferences. I love hearing papers and the subject matter, but I didn't like the rigmarole of academia. I was a professor. I ran a master's program at Ohio State for 5 years, and then I was a professor at a small college in Virginia for 7 or 8. And when she had the chance to move up into this really phenomenal position, I stayed home to write. I'm a stay-at-home dad now. And so that's, you know, I have this background in academia, so when I research something, I treat it as I would, you know, a profession. So people are always impressed or they're shocked. Even writers are like, wow, look at all your research. And I said, no, I just cite everything. You know, Craig, my friend Craig Pittman, the great Florida writer, he's wonderful. And he's every bit as conscientious as me, every bit. But he just doesn't cite like I do. You know, he doesn't come from that background.
I was looking at the footnotes at the end of this book, and I don't want to scare you off the book because it doesn't read like a book full of footnotes. But there are a lot of different
there'll be
sources.
hundreds. I had a book, one of my books, my editor was like, we want to get rid of the footnotes. And I said, we can get rid of my contract because I'm not going to give you a book.
Wow.
I'm not cutting them. I won't do it.
Why? Why do you feel that strongly about them?
One, I don't want to be sued, and I have been sued. But I also want to be very clear when I make a point. You know, I'm sure in this book on Arcadia, and we'll talk about Arcadia's a tough place, and I'm going to get hate mail. When you write publicly, I got hate mail over the Hugo book. Who would be mad about me calling the Hugo? You know what I mean? I've got hate mail. Yeah, right. I mean, you know, you get all that, but I don't want to make an argument that is not bolstered by the sources that I've shown, you know, and I'm not, you know, shrill, even though some of the, you'll see some lines in there where I'm like, you know, calling it like I see it. You know, this is a tough thing, you know. Frank Schaub, I believe that district attorney, his son is a judge, you know. I'm not going to, you know, deal with that without, you know, I don't know the man, maybe he's wonderful, you know, I'm not making any kind of comment, but it's just, if I'm making comments about children whose house was burned down, or, you know, school board members that were saying awful things in the press, I'm gonna point that out, you know, and I think it's very important to me. Maybe if I had a journalistic background, you know, you call it like you see it, you roll with it, because you got the paper behind you, and they got their attorneys, you know, you have a legal read. You know, I only get one legal read at the end of my books.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And, you know, virtually every article that goes in the papers get a legal read at the Tampa Bay Times. Some lawyer somewhere has read that article before it went out.
I don't know if that's as true anymore now with diminished staff.
Exactly, with the internet.
But that kind of brings me to the next question, which is Arcadia. He has a line in the book that I love where he calls Arcadia the Deadwood of Florida. And then you quote from that Patrick Smith book, A Land Remembered, where a character says, the toughest town in Florida, I'll tell you what it is, it's Arcadia. So talk to us about what Arcadia,
yeah, well,
how it got that reputation.
And you would ask, you know, how I come to books. They're books that are subjects that they seem so diverse, but they're near and dear to my heart. My PhD is in East European history. I taught the fall of communism. I lived in Serbia. I did a Fulbright in Croatia, and so that's how I came to the Hugo, right? Even though it's the Hugo card, it's silly, it's my background, it's my interest. And then I try to brand it in a way that people will buy it. You know what I mean? It's like a pop song, you need a hook. No matter what you write, I would tell any writer that, you know, play to an audience, even if you have your strength, play to your strength, but then, and so I did a book, you didn't mention, I did a book for tenure, a monograph on the serial Olympics, and how the country fell apart in the city. And the Buccaneers, I grew up down here. The Buccaneers are my favorite team, and they were terrible. So when I went to college, people would go, hey, who do you like? I said, I love the Bucs. I lost incredible numbers of games in the 80s, and we love them. And so that's that book. And so the Swamp Peddlers, growing up in Punta Gorda, right across the river was this Leviathan Port Charlotte. 200,000 lots, roads to nowhere. And that was just always in my head. And Arcadia was in my head because I was in high school in 1986, 87. I was a freshman, sophomore, 88. And the Ray children hit the national news. And we always knew that, you know, Punta Gorda was a sleepy little town with some southern people, but if you kept going east, you know, I had some country buddies and they'd go, hey, you think I'm country? You should go to Arcadia with me. You know, and Arcadia was always just almost legendary. It wasn't just me, you know, seeing the Ray case and being angry and wanting to I can point out terrible facts in the history of any town, any town in Florida, any town in the South, any town in America, you can go back through papers and find murders and find, lynchings and horrible things in the past. But I wanted to show how Arcadia, the Deadwood of Florida, Arcadia, you have to think about this. In 1900, Florida had 500,000 people. 500,000 people. There's 24 million people here today, right? And in 1900, those 500,000 people lived almost entirely north of I-4, right? Some in Tampa. Tampa was only, in the 1880s, you have Lakeland, Tampa, Punta Gorda, Arcadia, Fort Myers became a municipality. That in the 1880s, 1890s. And so this was the frontier. People don't really, south of I-4 was an open range, and it was a frontier. And frontier areas, as you know, the Wild West, it's rugged individualism, it's violence, it's, you take the land, you conquer the land, and you shoot those who are gonna prevent you from doing it. I mean, that's how we conquered the West. And Arcadia was very much that way. Punta Gorda was that way. In 1890, I know our jail in Punta Gorda, they had like 700 people, was a boxcar, right? These towns down here were tough. South Florida was where you came, if you were in like Poughkeepsie and a banker and you stole all the money in the bank, you ran to Florida. You killed your wife's lover in a fit of rage, you ran to Florida.
And you could disappear in those
You could
days.
disappear,
Yeah.
very much so. And so, another thing about Arcadia that I found just fascinating is that people don't know this, but when you go from Arcadia or Charlotte County diagonally to Kissimmee, south of Orlando, that's the 90-mile prairie. It's called the 90-mile prairie, the Big 90. People don't even use that term anymore, but it was the Great Florida Prairie. And the Spaniards had left their herds when they left, and so you could catch cows. So there were Confederates who came out of the war, they had lost everything, Georgia's a mess, and they moved south into Florida, moved south of Manatee, and they were called cow hunters. Florida didn't have cowboys, it had cow hunters. And so in my book, I talk about early Arcadia. Frederick Remington came down here in the 1890s. He is tired of the West because it wasn't as wild and free anymore. He had this very idealistic view of the West. So they sent him to Arcadia to cover a range war. So we have a range war in Florida in 1895. The last Florida range war was in 1932.
Wow.
People in Florida killing each other over cows, right? And so Arcadia was the center of that. And Remington came to Arcadia, and he did not like Florida cow hunters. They wore slouch hats because it's so hot. They didn't have, I don't know what he thought cowboys were, Gene Autry. I don't know, Remington, right? But he comes down to Florida, and another thing, they have whips. He thought, real cowboys don't have whips. And what they needed to tell him was, well, real cowboys have to go out in the palmetto bushes, and they need dogs. If any of you ever hunted hogs, I've gone out with friends. It's crazy, but most hog hunters have several dogs. Catch dogs that chase them into the bush, bulldogs that grab them, little dogs that chase them, and Remington thought this was awful. When he came to Arcadia, and they were just tough people living on the Florida frontier. And so in the background of the Ray story and the Richardson story is a town founded on violence. A town not afraid of violence. A double-barreled, two-fisted town founded by a Civil War veteran and a Seminole Indian veteran, an Indian War veteran. When he left, the two main families, the Parker families, that's Colonel Parker. The Parkers today are in Arcadia. Ziba King was Florida's great rancher. He was an AWOL Confederate. And this is how far they came down. Just close to Sarasota. But as Florida progressed and the big change came, Arcadia was a successful city in 1920. But when land suddenly became not valuable for what you could grow on it, but valuable for location, right? Arcadia was a much better place to have your farm in 1900 than Sarasota. But by 1925, where would you rather live? 2025, it's obvious, right? And so as the rest of coastal Florida moves into the post-World War II period, into the 20th century, Arcadia can only fall back on agriculture, can only fall back on ranching, which is wonderful professions, but culturally it's a tough place. And so Arcadia became the place where you had industries that Sarasota doesn't want, that Charlotte doesn't want, that Lee doesn't want, a mental institution, a prison, a sex offender prison, right? Those kind of, and I was telling my sister today, I thought, anything west of I-75 is kind of the garden. And anything east of I-75 is the workshop. It's the farm. I mean, we have to get our milk somewhere. We have to get our cows somewhere. And so this is that old Florida that has resisted change from day one. It's a fascinating place and one of my favorite places in Florida to write about. It's remarkable to me.
Well, you do bring it so to life in the book. I don't want you to step on your story, so I don't know how much you want to answer this question, but James Richardson was convicted of the death of his 7 children. He served 21 years before he was freed. So why was he convicted? I mean, I know there's a lot of answers to that, but anything that really stands out to you?
So for those of you who most of you probably haven't read the book, it's only been out a week or two. James Richardson was a very poor migrant worker from Daytona Beach, Jacksonville area. He'd work in various, he was a garbage man, and then when he couldn't find work, he came to where there were jobs in the orange fields. And in Arcadia, the African-American section of Arcadia, even to this day, is called the quarters, right? And that, at first I heard that, and I knew that as a kid. I was like, oh, that's awful. But it was, Immokalee too has the quarters. It means workers' quarters. It doesn't mean slave quarters, because these places didn't exist during the Civil War and before that. It's where they had big dormitory-like housing. And Richardson lived in that section of town, and he went into the fields with his wife. This is in 1967, in October. And there was a babysitter next door who watched 3 of the kids. The other 3 or 4 were in the still segregated African-American school, Smith Brown School. And they had an open lunch, and they came home. They consumed beans and rice in a dish called hogshead, and they began to die, one after another. And there's these horrible scenes. I don't want to go into it. The children go back to school, they begin dying in their classrooms in front of their peers. I interviewed the son of the teacher who held one of the babies as she went limp, right? And they rushed him to the hospital. They called James in from the fields with his wife, and he's in the chapel, and a minister at the hospital says, James, your children have died. And his wife collapses. And a few minutes later, a nurse comes in and says, does he have insurance? Meaning hospital insurance, not life insurance. And he said, well, I tried to buy some yesterday. There was a traveling insurance salesman, a white man, going in a black neighborhood. I thought, how strange. And I randomly found someone whose father did that in Palmetto, in Bradenton, in Wamama, these tough places, because they made more money. A white family would pay $5 a month or whatever, but you go paycheck to paycheck, and they pay in cash, and they paid more. And so you would think it would be a bad job, but they could actually make money doing that. And so he had the great misfortune, the night before these children died, somehow, of meeting an insurance salesman. And so right away, the minister asked him, she said, no, I don't have insurance. I tried to buy it. Then a sheriff comes to talk to him, and he claims that James said he had insurance. There's no record of this. The insurance salesman was interviewed. There's no record at all. He showed his books. I have the books. No policy was written, and James didn't have any money. But even if he did, the policy they talked about wouldn't have covered accidental death. So there was no way that he was going to, and in the press, the sheriff began saying he had double indemnity life insurance. Like, that's the old movie, right? Double, it sounds seedy. It's not true. It wasn't true. And either the sheriff, who was said to be corrupt, and lots of rumors, and I got various DEA and FBI files. There was a lot of smoke, a lot of statements about this guy. But he, more than anything else, ran out ahead and said, well, we got him very quickly. And so James was arrested, And eventually, the case was handed over to a district attorney who was out of Bradenton, and he was hard driving, win at all costs. A northerner, went to Stetson and had come here, so he wasn't part of old Florida, but he represented from Bradenton to Naples, over into the prairie. Huge area, which he would drive, and he was just, if the law called for a year in jail, he'd go for a year. If it called for life, whatever it was, he went for the max. And he took the case. And when the case went to trial in Fort Myers, there's all these, it's unbelievable. They're in Lee County Courthouse. There's a black man, no black people on the jury. And there's Robert E. Lee above the judge in the trial. And Lee County had a tough racial history. And so he's convicted. He had a terrible attorney. He was a do-gooder, a white man from Daytona Beach, a nice guy who had never been in a criminal court, who took the case out of the kindness of his heart because no one else would. He had a public defender from Arcadia or not. And he had no clue, didn't attack motive. There was no motive. You couldn't prove it. Never interviewed the insurance man. And the worst thing was, the district attorney didn't turn over the interviews with the insurance man and with the minister. That's exculpatory evidence. You cannot do that. That's against all ethics, all codes, and it's illegal. And so James is convicted. He's given the death penalty. The babysitter, and here's the other thing. The babysitter had been in prison for murdering her husband.
And she was mad at him too.
And
right?
she was mad at him.
James.
And it's also very possible that, I'm good friends with Pete Gallagher, one of the reporters who dealt with the case in the 80s. It's very possible that a child picked up parathion. They used to use it for roach killer. You'd spread it on the floor. It's very dangerous, and you can't do that anymore, but they did it in the old days in Florida. And it's very possible a kid put it in there.
That it was an accident.
It's very possible. And do I know if James Richardson was innocent? I think 99.9%, I'm sure, but I don't know. But I do know he shouldn't have gotten the death penalty. He shouldn't have gone to trial. They had no evidence, but this was the time and the place, and journalists began coming into town. This was a big story. This was on Walter Cronkite in 1967. Journalists came in and they started going, this is a little odd. This is strange the way he's been treated. And they started to look at Arcadia too. Miami journalists would come over there and go, oh my God, this is another century here. This is Philadelphia, Mississippi. This isn't Florida that we know, right? And to me, it is Florida. It's old Florida. And you'd see a lot of Sarasota writers would go over there and go, whoa, and they'd interview Arcadians, and one local historian said, yeah, that's our town. We're 50 miles and 50 years from Sarasota.
Yeah.
That was the saying, Arcadia.
I was so interested when he was freed. The warden of the prison considered him an innocent man. And didn't he say that the other prisoners were usually just furious and abusive to anyone who killed a child, but everybody respected and liked James?
Yep, everyone. He was a very amiable man, a likable man. He had a very low education. He was borderline illiterate. He was hard of hearing. But most people who met him, virtually everyone who met him, really loved him, liked him. He was a nice man. And his wife stayed with him and testified that he never would do that. But certainly, if he did do it, he was severely confused, because any idiot would know you didn't buy a policy, you don't get the money, you don't have a policy. So it didn't happen, but I think the sheriff wanted to run out ahead, and he loved the press and the attention. They had no modern policing techniques, no evidence gathering, it was just a mess. It
No
was
restraints.
no restraints either, right?
Well, on a lighter note, there are so many totally wild characters in this book, including Pete Gallagher, who you just mentioned. Do you have a favorite? Can you tell us about one of the...
Well, my favorite character in all this is a man named Mark Lane. Some of you might have known him in the earlier days. He was a far, far, far left Harlem, a Jewish lawyer politician. He was almost like a Kardashian, like when something would happen, he'd run out ahead, get his face in the news. He represented Jane Fonda during her arrests. He represented James Earl Ray. He represented Jim Jones. He survived Jonestown. He was in Jonestown when they drank the Kool-Aid. And he said, I don't need to drink it, I'll tell your story. And they went, oh, okay. Like,
I was just amazed when I read that. They let it, I mean, he could have been forced to die with everybody.
well, Mark Lane, and my favorite was, he's the one who popularized the grassy knoll conspiracy theory. Mark Lane, as soon as the assassination happened, within like a month, he had Marguerite Oswald on the stage in New York, claiming that her son could never have done it. And he was selling $10 a ticket. And so Lane, before that, when he was a state rep in New York, went with the head of the NAACP down to Mississippi. They flew down and they got arrested by going into a whites-only bathroom together because Lane claimed to be a freedom rider. He just got off the plane, went in the bathroom, got arrested, got pulled, bailed out and flew home and, fight the good fight. That was Lane. I love this guy. And so he was reading Newsweek and he would travel the country doing Kennedy conspiracy talks. And he reads about this case in Newsweek and there's something wrong with it. And he's like, I want to meet this guy. So he calls the attorney and then he sets up a talk on Kennedy at USF. So he comes to USF and rents a car and drives over to Arcadia, looks around, and then he goes to Rayford, and he interviews Richardson and decides to write a book called Arcadia in 1970. And it was supposed to be really hard hit. It was terrible. I don't criticize other authors. What I mean is it was about 75 pages long and about 100 pages of trial transcript. The names were misspelled. DeSoto County had a space in it. Someone wrote, there's a lot of smoke here. This man's probably innocent, but it's too bad Ralph Nader didn't write this. Because we know who wrote this, Mark Lane. And so it failed when other writers might have gotten him out, or might have gotten a new hearing, and so what happens, to make a long story short, is years later, there's my other favorite character is a man named Remus Griffin.
Oh yeah.
Griffin is an old Florida name. Remus is a white truck driver, pot smoker, partier. He's the kind of guy who can go to honky tonk in Arcadia and go, I'll fight all y'all, come outside. And he would. And he'd get beat up. Like, that's the kind of guy he was. And I interviewed his daughter, and Remus is a character. And in Punta Gorda, we had several of those. And Remus doesn't like the police. He was a minor, and he had tried to steal cocaine from the evidence locker at the DeSoto County Courthouse. At 17, breaking into the courthouse. And he got sent to DeSoto Correctional for adults at 17. And he got out after a couple years and was angry, rightfully so, with the police. And he's dating a woman who's a secretary of the former assistant district attorney. And he would come to work, the story was in various papers, that he'd come to work and by noon he'd be blotto, drunk. And he'd say, I put an innocent man in prison. And he was part of the investigation, but he didn't try the case, didn't work the case. He interviewed people, but he had the files, including the interviews that had not been turned over. And Remus goes, honey, can I borrow your keys? I'm gonna go get some cigarettes. And he breaks into the office and steals the files.
Hell yeah.
Right? Hell yeah. Right? And so a hero, an absolute hero, a Florida folk hero, right? And he steals them and then realizes if the sheriff is who people say he is, and I'm also on parole, it's a felony, I could go back and do a full. And he realized I can't have these files. I might end up in the Peace River or never be heard from again. So he gives it to a woman who didn't like the sheriff, used to work for the sheriff, and she lives on the Seminole Indian Reservation outside of Clewiston. And I think, I don't know this, but I think they put the files out there because the state sheriff couldn't go there. I'm guessing. It was in the Devil's Grove. That's what it's called.
Yeah.
And it was in a trailer park for 8 or 9 years. Until, and this is the movie, it's unbelievable. Until the babysitter, years later, has Alzheimer's. And she's in Wauchula at a nursing home. in Hardy Manor Estates or something, and every day she says, I killed them babies. Every day. And we don't know if that meant she fed them the food and feels terrible as anyone would, or if she did it on purpose. But one of her caregivers was from the quarters. That message went back to the quarters. I don't know how it got from who to who, probably through the church, probably through the churches, then back to Mark Lane, right? And Lane comes rolling in 1988, and he has a, truth to power, he always has these big things where he's out front, and Lane says, anyone has any information, it's time to come forward, speak truth to power, and people leave. It's at the old Smith Brown school, the African-American school that's now a community center, and a man comes up, the last person is a white guy in a cowboy hat, and he goes, saying someone has a box of files. Would you want to read those? And he said, yes, I would. And that was the beginning of the freeing of James Richardson. They found out that these files were there all the time, that they weren't turned over, and Mark Lane, I believe truly, out of all the stuff he did in his career, this was the one that was really, truly good.
Yeah.
And he gets it on Inside Edition. So James Richardson in Arcadia is the first ever episode of Inside Edition. And it goes on there, and it ends with, and it's David Frost. Remember Frost Nixon? He was the first, not Bill, what's his name? The Fox guy, but the first.
O'Reilly.
Yeah, O'Reilly. Before O'Reilly, it was David Frost. I didn't know that. And he says, I think James Richardson is innocent. If you think so too, write to your governor. And they put the governor's address on the screen. And Bob Martinez, a Republican from Tampa, gets 10,000 letters in a week. And he's like, I got to do something. And he appoints Janet Reno, who's a state's attorney out of Miami, who has a bulletproof reputation for honesty by both parties. It takes about 3 months, sends Department of Law Enforcement, Florida Department of Law Enforcement investigators all over to pour through the evidence, goes through it herself, and then comes into Arcadia in 1988 in this dramatic hearing. The district attorney was there, an older man in his late 70s, and they spit fire at each other. Mark Lane and Frank Schaub, calling each other names, had to be separated by the sheriff. And Janet Reno issues her report and says that this needs to be nolle pros. This whole thing needs to be thrown out. And they threw the case out. And Mark Lane walks out of the courthouse with James Richardson. And it's powerful stuff. And it took him it took him longer to get money from the state to pay him, because he was never declared innocent. And that the Innocence Project and the money goes to people declared innocent, where they find the right guy. James was never declared innocent, so they wrote a law, and it was unanimously passed, left and right. And they wrote a law that said, if you committed a crime between this date and this, it was for James. It was like the James Richardson law, and he was paid. And he died recently, a couple years ago. Sad story. He came back to Arcadia, and he went to when the children died, a little African-American girl sang How Great Thou Art. And in 1967, the African-Americans in the audience were weeping, screaming. It was crazy how bad it was. And years later, the mayor of Arcadia was that little girl. And I tried to interview her, and she was running for office, and people in Arcadia don't want to talk.
One time they don't want to talk.
Right, and she invites him back, and they had him speak at the church, and they went out to the cemetery, and they had 7 children say words at the graves, and it's just incredibly powerful.
And I don't want you to think he's told you the whole book, because he hasn't. There are so many subplots. And then we don't have time to go into it, but one of my favorite is when F. Lee Bailey came down and was fighting with Frank Schaub.
Frank Schaub, the district attorney, was the first person to ever beat F. Lee Bailey at trial. And it was a trial based on Longboat Key. A whole nother case
Hold on, but it's in the book.
Yeah,
There's
it's in the
so
book.
much that's in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Let's
think
get
it's ready
to some
for-
audience questions. Yeah, so
Yeah.
if you have a question, raise your hand
Yeah.
and Pam will call on you. You don't have to use the microphone.
Okay.
You raise your voice. Any questions? Go ahead, in the back of the class.
So, I'm a Gary Marmino student.
Oh my God.
They made us read Albion's Seed, which talks about English folkways in the US. And I've gotten tired, every 6 months or so on Facebook, someone will write in about how crackers got their name and it's from the cracking of whips. And then I go and quote Albion's Seed and say, no, actually cracker is an old term that came over from England. And then I get dumped on by everyone who loves
I'm with you.
a land remembered. So, and of course you can't talk about this area without talking about crackers. So do you have a take on where the derivation of, the origin of the term cracker to refer to
Yeah.
Floridians?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, everyone said it was cracking whips, you know,
Yeah.
southern Georgia settlers coming down. But Ben Franklin used the term.
Uh-huh.
Ben Franklin didn't like the Appalachian knuckleheads. My wife's from West Virginia. They were always causing trouble, right, in the old days, his various rebellions. And he called them crackers.
Okay.
Appalachians,
Okay.
right? And that's way before this. I believe the term even appears in Shakespeare. Right, and I think, and I may be wrong, but you're right. It's not cracking whips, and people will fight you on Facebook. Them's fighting words, right? They'll fight you on Facebook, anyways. But they'll fight you in downtown, Punta Gorda over that. That's right. My grandfather told me.
Yeah.
But
Well, they read it in a land remembered, which
Yep.
is now gospel, so you can't question it. So.
yeah, and he's not a Floridian.
Right.
It's like Louis Laborde, right? He lived in Hollywood, but he wrote westerns,
All
right?
right.
Yeah, it's a good question, though.
But you didn't finish the answer. So it goes back to Shakespeare, but what does the word cracker?
It's someone who to crack jokes, to be a cracker. Like that's I'm not a etymologist, but I mean that's the kind of the background of that is to be irreverent, to be against authority, and you can see how that relates to Appalachia, right? I mean, definitely.
Because I have friends from Ireland, and they call it the crake, or crake.
That's
it's
it.
cracker.
So clearly, it's not cracking whips. You know what I mean? And the term, I mean, in the last 20 years too, it's become, offensive in popular culture. I'm certainly, people equate it, to the N-word. But there's a Cracker House Museum at the State Fairgrounds in Tampa. It's the Cracker House Museum. There's Cracker House books and cracker festivals, and most people, white farmers from old families in Florida. That's not an offensive term. It's a term of, and they're proud of it because there's not many. But that would definitely be Arcadia. Definitely that's in that world. And proudly so. Many people there have 5th and 6th, and I met someone from Arcadia who can tie their family back to British soldiers in the brief period that Britain controlled Florida. I mean, that's remarkable. In this state,
I have a question.
yeah.
Okay, so you really could have, I think, written 2 books
Yeah.
from this one book. So there's the James Richardson story we talked a lot about, then there's also the Ray brothers. It's why did you decide that they needed to live in the same?
Yeah, and I struggle with that. The academic in me, you're always worried about argument. You're worried about, are you going to support this argument in sub-arguments? And I didn't want to just say, these are 2 stories from one place. I wanted to tie them, to the culture of this old Florida town. Could a black man have been wrongfully accused and imprisoned? 91 people have been wrongfully, that we know of. There's probably double that right now. That goes anywhere. The Ray story, Ryan White. You remember Ryan White, the poor boy in Indiana who got HIV and the town went nuts and they chased him out. And when they chased him out, where did he move? To another town called Arcadia, Indiana. And so when so the Ray boys were kicked out of church, kicked out of school when Arcadia found out. And that's when Arcadia got the name, A Town Without Pity. ABC News called Arcadia A Town Without Pity. And it went national. And so within 1 year of 18 months, you have the Rays and you have Richardson, right, in this one town. And Arcadians were just they were angry, they're mad, don't call us, don't lift up our, any town would be, don't call us this. But at the same time, they want to know what's happened with Richardson. They want to know. But most believe the Rays should not have been in school, regardless of what the federal government said, regardless of what the laws were on segregating kids with diseases, And so I wanted to use these two unrelated events. They didn't know each other. And I spoke with the Ray's sister the other day. I couldn't get her to do an interview, but she called me when the book came out. I sent her a book, and we talked for an hour 2 days ago. And it was moving, and she didn't even know James Richardson, right? And she was little, but that wasn't in her world. But I think by talking about the community's response to both of these events, that's what draws it together. And it's, when I thought about this, I thought, A Town Without Pity, AIDS, Race, and Redemption. There's always got to be a redemption. Man's let out of prison, redemption. But the more I got into it, I thought, no, this is resistance. This is what Arcadia does. This is what old Florida does, And so what tied them together was when the Rays went to school and the federal government said they have to come back, they have a rally at the rodeo arena. And there's 1,000 white people, rebel flags, and they're railing against homosexuals because they blame them for HIV. They're railing against the government, and the leader stands up and he says, they're shoving this down our throats, meaning the kids going to school, like they did with civil rights. And I thought, wow, that's the whole book right there. That's the line. That's the whole purpose of this. And I struggled with this for a couple years, One, it was so dark. I've never done something so dark, and I carried it. It's ugly. I fought through this. My wife's a professional historian and editor, and she was like, well, just keep your eyes on the prize. It's not about the Rays. It's not about Richardson. It's about Arcadia. It's about defining that part of Florida. Show how it's different. Show how it's the town. And so that's why I kept trying to intersperse the history of the town with each of these events.
And it does.
For the gentleman in the blue sweatshirt.
Yeah.
Is there some sort of punishment for either the police or the detectives or the school board or the district attorney, either there or in real estate development? Like if you ever, when you're writing about development and selling swampland, is there any sort of
Retribution, right?
somebody like a Carl Hyacin character come in and
Neither retribution nor repentance.
Sets fire to the development, like Carl Hyacin books. Right? It's the same guy every time. It's Carl in each book. Right? I love those books, but it's the same book, No, not really. Usually when someone's a judge for many, many years and starts to, have problems on the bench, you're kind of asked to retire. It's ugly to go into those. You're going to reopen cases, and so you're just kind of. Frank Schaub, I got his FBI, Florida Department of Law Enforcement file, and it was some people saying he had stills down by the river, that he was sleeping with the women in the office for pay, and that he was even some drug stuff, murders, and all these little counties were known during the cocaine cowboy years for flying dope from Colombia. You'd fly over Sarasota, and you'd land in like Northport when no one was there, or you'd land in these places like Arcadia or Lakeland, or in these big cow pastures. That was famous, and so lots of people thought most sheriffs in these counties were corrupt, even if they weren't. That was just what they were, because there was so much criminality going on. But typically when that happened, unless there was a real obvious crime, what I can say that most of them are like, well, he retired, he lost the election, he's gone. Don't bring that up. And the same thing happened. Schaub was older. He had some trouble on the bench. He became a judge and had some trouble as a judge on the bench. And he got, the Florida Supreme Court chided him. The Florida Bar chided him for some things that didn't relate to this. And it was like, it's time. And that's what happens to a lot of these lifetime or long-serving positions. So unfortunately, no. What really happened was the DeSoto County School Board had to pay 1-point-something million to the Rays. Pharmaceutical companies had to pay to all people with hemophilia for not protecting The federal government gave money to people with hemophilia because this really wasn't Armageddon. If you had hemophilia, you took factor VIII, you injected yourself with HIV in the early 80s. I don't know the numbers.
Did you say it was like
Thousands.
50% of
Probably, yeah.
people
It was
that-
all over the place. I just
Yeah.
chose
Yeah,
one.
likely more because of the way they were,
Yep.
not diagnosing.
And then,
Right.
yeah, and people associated HIV in the beginning with homosexuality, and so if you had hemophilia and you got it, you didn't want to tell anyone, so you died of something else, and yeah, just tough stuff, and the last thing I want to say is elections and allowing your elected officials to do these things, it has consequences. They gave the sheriff free rein to keep order in the quarters. Part of it was 1967. That was the summer of rage. Tampa had riots. St. Pete would soon have riots. Tampa had big riots all over America. And so in Arcadia, we're going to keep order here. Well, there's not going to be a riot here. It's Arcadia. It's tiny, right? But that's the way it was. Keep order. This is how we do it here. We're not one of you big city liberals, and a lot of that,
I think we have a question over here too.
I was wondering if you think you're kind of punching down a little bit. You talked a little bit about pitching to a certain audience, and I think this is kind of it. And I wonder if you would compare, the response to COVID. So we closed the beaches, we closed the parks, we insisted on, babies and children getting immunized, a lot of crazy stuff. And also legally, Kamala Harris's office, fought compensation to people. I'm sure you're aware of that. Wrongly accused people, and there's a lot of legal stuff. I tried to find his name, but there was a guy at her office put in jail, this black man, and it went to these appeals, and they said, well, this evidence should have been disclosed to you. I couldn't find his name. I'll find it.
Sure.
Give me your card. But procedurally the time is by, or procedurally you didn't file it right. The guy's in jail representing himself, and has some occasional assistance from a public defender, and the prediction was that he'll probably die in prison. So I don't know. I mean, is the reaction of Arcadia? I've been to Arcadia. I actually found it was very diverse. They have a lot of great Mexican food there.
Yeah, that's a big difference. Yeah.
There's some interesting multicultural. I mean, there's definitely a lot of underclass. Food bank. I mean, they've gotten hit really hard now by the citrus greening. But I don't know. I just see this audience and I see the people. And I look at the COVID response and it was nuts. I mean, and still people are like, well, that was the best science we knew, or that was what we knew at the time. We've had yellow fever and things before. I mean, we knew it was crazy to close the beaches.
Here's what I would say first of all about the Ray
And
situation.
people died because of that.
Okay, here's what I have to say about the Ray situation is I hear a lot from people from Arcadia went through that. We just didn't know. We just didn't know, right? And it's not me to forgive, to understand, right? I mean, we were all terrified of AIDS when in school, but by the time this came out, and this is what I don't understand, the school board got an attorney and immediately kept them. They were kicked out of church, and then they were kept out of school. They weren't allowed in school at all. They were given 9 hours of instruction a week at home. That was the first solution. And the Rays started to complain, and it got into the press. And the school board decided, we'll give you a portable next to the campus. What they did not do was look around the state and see what have other people done? What have other counties done? Miami-Dade, 2 years earlier, had kicked out 3 students. And this is, the biggest school system in the state, Dade County. 3 little Haitian girls with HIV. The father had sued, they had settled and apologized and put them back into school, right? Bradenton kept out a kid and settled. Other bigger school districts. But by the time Arcadia decided to do that and then circled the wagons, other counties had already settled, right? So they knew legally how this was gonna go, and they did it anyways. And the other thing was the Supreme Court had also ruled on tuberculosis before the Ray situation hit the fan. And that TB case was in early '87. It was a Flagler Beach teacher, an African-American woman, had TB. And when that's in remission, you're not transmissible. They fired her, and that went all the way to the Supreme Court through the '80s. And when that case came out, the Supreme Court ruled for her and said, if you're not transmissible, you can work, you can't be fired in jobs, whatever your job is, for that. The newspapers and legal experts said AIDS case. the Supreme Court has ruled on AIDS. That's how it was viewed in the legal community. And so Arcadia went forward with overwhelming illegal, rulings that you're going to lose. You're going to pay out millions for this. And so I find it fascinating how the locals resisted en masse. That's what I find amazing and interesting. They would have done it in Sarasota too. There were people in Sarasota. There were people in Manhattan. There were people in the rich suburbs of New Jersey that were losing their minds and doing things, bomb threats, boycotts, just like Arcadia. It's not that they were so different. What I found was the culture of resistance in the town was lockstep. It was us versus them, and including the Rays. The Rays were the enemy. The Rays weren't just keep them out. As soon as the Rays went to the press, they were hated, ostracized, called low hygiene people, called, every name in the book, bomb threats at their house. It got, and so it's that cultural resistance. It's not, and to me, the average Joe, I get it. These are farming people. They're not reading the New York Times. They're not, these are average Joes, good working people, Christian people, right? But it's the response that was so over the top as a community. The New York Times reported on it. The Washington Post was like, Arcadia has one message for America. They didn't do anything wrong. The Rays shouldn't be in school. The Rays have only put these kids out there for personal gain. And so that is what I think is different, right? That they willingly went against what all legal advice. You're going to lose. You can't do this. It's going to get ugly. They welcomed it. That was fascinating to me.
I know we're done, but can I ask Jason one more thing?
Sure.
He has a fun hobby where he reads and writes about little known or long forgotten Florida books. And since we're in a bookstore, do you want to just toss out a few titles you think everybody should get to know?
Oh geez, I have when I have time, I haven't done it in a while, on Instagram, I have Florida book blurbs, and I find old books, and I like Lobster Boy. That was a good one, about a Gibsonton. Lobster Boy was murdered by his wife and son, and that was a crazy one. No Deadly Drug on Frank Schaub and the trial on Longboat Key. Any kind of weird and older Florida books I'm a fan of.
No Deadly Drug?
No Deadly Drug.
I'll
That
have to
was John McDonald.
What about the guys that you wrote about that took a shopping cart and walked through Florida?
Oh, come on. You have to help me with that one.
The Russell.
Yes.
Is it
Karen
Kent?
Russell's brother.
Yeah, I think it's Kent Russell. We
Kent-
have that downstairs.
Yeah, they
great
pushed
book.
a shopping cart with three of their buddies with all of their clothes and food and probably alcohol from Pensacola to Miami.
Yeah, that's a great book. And while you're downstairs looking for them, don't forget to get Jason's books.
Yes.
We have a bunch right up front. And I know we weren't able to get to everyone's questions. If you get the book, and it's 7 o'clock, so I'm sorry, we do have to.
Could I just ask a quick detour question? My antennas went up when you mentioned that you were a Fulbrighter in Croatia, as was I.
Oh my God.
And so I wanted to see what university and what years.
This was 2000, 2001.
Okay,
Yeah.
I preceded you by a decade. I was there at the last part of the war.
Oh my God.
I was
yeah.
in the Faculty of Architecture,
Yeah.
and I'm a historical architect and urban planner.
Wow.
So I was documenting the vernacular landscape that was
Yeah.
changing because of the economic effects,
Wow.
and then the cultural genocide.
Man, that's a heady time.
Wow.
Heady
It was
time.
a very heavy time, but I'll tell you, you do see some of the best of humanity.
Yeah.
You see the best
Yeah.
and the worst. So outstanding.
Yeah,
But my
it's-
antennas went up.
You should be giving a talk of your own next
Yeah,
time.
let's give Jason a big
Thank
hand.
you.